Everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. Um, Kind of a follow-up vid to the last long one. I'm still sick, by the way, hence the previously really short one. But there was sort of a follow-up line of questions to the more autobiographical video, and the main line of questioning is, what do I think spiritually? Am I agnostic, atheist, or theist? Was I ever one of those things and then not one of those things? In other words, did I change belief systems at any point? Pretty complicated question. I'll try to be succinct about it. I was raised Protestant, or more specifically Baptist, and from a very early age I was very obsessed, fixated with religion, death, moral concepts, like why people behave they do. Like, as far back as I remember, and when I was really little, like 8 or 9, I guess, I found a book about Greek myths, and it was just really, it just lit a fire under me about studying religion. I thought it was amazing. And then I went from Greek to Roman to, Greek to Roman to Norse to Shinto to Buddhism to Hinduism. By the way, these aren't religions I was ascribing to. This is just religions that I studied in that order. Just getting any books I could for a period of many, many, many years from childhood on. I was really fascinated. Eventually, when I was a teenager, I read the entire Bible, like the way you would read a storybook, like, in other words, front to back, rather than hopping around, which is what most people do, and that's not a criticism, that's a completely normal thing to do. But I also read, around the same time, to get a good feel for it, The Origin of the Species. And I was studying biology in college several years after that, and I think during that period I would definitely have considered myself to be an agnostic. And also I went to religious school when I was a kid. So I've been inundated with religious information as far back as I can remember. So very spiritually focused, not religiously averse. And that's actually, well, I'll get to that in a minute. I was definitely an agnostic early on, and it's kind of funny, like reading the Bible made me question every religious system. And then studying biology, it's usually the opposite for people. I don't really know why. Seeing the intricacies and the complexity of biological systems, especially on a cellular level, I was like, wow, this is amazing. How could this have just been by chance? Now, that's not a good argument, though. Sure, things can happen by chance. I absolutely think evolution is a real process, by the way. I'm not a creationist, or what's the right word for that? Because it's interesting to note that evolution was actually promoted by religious people originally. This idea that it completely does away with Christianity is absolute nonsense. Similarly, the Big Bang Theory. I guess that disproves religion. Well, the Big Bang Theory was initially theorized by a priest, so I don't think that's really a decent argument against any kind of spiritual endeavor. And I've noticed that there tends to be two camps when it comes to religion. You've got people who are, and interestingly, it fills both sides of the argument. You've got people who are completely apathetic or uninterested in learning about religion. They don't question things. People who are very, very, very religious tend to actually fall into that camp. They've not actually read their sacred text. They don't think about death. They kind of put it on the back burner. They don't think about morality. They just do however they were raised. And similarly, a lot of atheists do the same. This is why I'm often annoyed with. I don't dislike atheists. I'm not an atheist, incidentally, as you could probably infer from what I'm saying right now. I don't dislike atheists. I actually get along with them very well. And what I don't like are what I call les atheists. And those are the people who use just absurdist arguments. I'll give you a great example of the two sides of the same coin. When I was a kid and I was reading, teenager, I was reading Origin of the Species. One of those Baptist preachers that I was exposed to as a kid, he said, "Evolution, that's just a theory, y'all," to his congregation, and I happened to be in that congregation. So afterwards, I thought, naive teenager that I was, well, I'll explain this to him, and it'll make sense. So I went to him and I explained, a theory in a scientific context is not the same thing as like, I theorize that Smurfs are real. It's based on a tremendous amount of information. The theory of revolution, for example, is the theory that the Earth revolves around the sun. There's mountains of evidence for that. It's just considered a theory because nobody's actually filmed it. And similarly, there's mountains of evidence that things evolve over time. And it annoys me additionally when people say, well, I believe in microevolution but not macroevolution. It's like, so you think somebody could run a mile in a day, but you don't think somebody could run 100 miles in 100 days? Because that's really the difference between the two. But anyway, I explained this to this guy in very fair, modest terms. It wasn't smarmy like, again, one of the issues I have with the more hardline atheists. There's an almost evangelical element to their behavior. But he nodded and, oh, okay, I didn't see it that way. That's very interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. The next week, evolution, well, that's just a theory. He said the exact same thing. It wasn't about the information. It was just repeating the same fallacies. Well, I see the same thing with hardline atheists, Oh, I see. So you think that a magic man in the sky made everything, and then he made a version of himself, which he brought down to earth to deal with stuff that people did bad, so he could forgive them by killing him. And, you reduce everything to the most absurd degree. And then similarly, I see Christians argue against atheists the same thing. Oh, so you think that nothing exploded and became everything for no reason? I see those arguments and they're ridiculous. They don't seem to be based on curiosity or interest, and that's where I was going with that. Is the preacher in that context? He didn't care about what was true or not. He didn't care about what was real or not. He only cared about, still sick, like I said, he only cared about his point of view being proven right repeatedly and never questioned. It was just about his perspective, which I think is a horrible way to live. Well, that's my problem with what I call let atheists. And I call them that because, they're sort of more internet atheists. They don't understand science. They don't understand philosophy. They don't understand public morality. They're just, it's like they read the back of Richard Dawkins' God Delusion and then decided that that's what they were going to do. It's the same thing with when I hear the Epicurean argument over and over again on the internet. That's all you ever hear, it seems. A 3,000-year-old argument with countless counter-arguments to it, repeated incessantly, and when someone argues against it, I didn't look at it that way, and then the next day the same person posts the same argument because they're not interested in learning more. So yeah, bottom line, I've studied every religion I can think of just about over the course of my life, out of both just a fascination with it. I mean, for me, I don't know why more people aren't interested. It's like one of the most interesting things. Studying the myths and legends that are just the cornerstone of different civilizations and attitudes, it's amazing. I don't know why people aren't more interested in that. But what I would, if I had to describe myself though, and my view, I would say with relative confidence that I am a monist, which there are incidentally Christian monists. But I think it would be regarded, at least in the mainstream, as a heretical viewpoint. I'm not sure. I need to study more on that, actually. But what a monist is someone who believes that there's sort of a transcendent identity to the universe, and that everything that makes up that universe makes up that entity. A good way of looking at it, or I think a good way of looking at it, is imagine. Well, actually, you don't even have to imagine. This is a fact. You're made of trillions of cells, right? Are you reduced whenever you have a nosebleed? Are you like less you? Um, and if not, how many cells would you have to lose before you stop losing your identity? Most people would argue, well, the part of me that's really me is my cerebrum, and so consciousness stems from that, and so that's really the only thing. Well, how many neurons in your cerebrum would you have to lose before you start becoming less you or being less of yourself? Now imagine for a minute that every single one of those cells was capable of independent thought. That's a good way of looking at the individual person in relation to what, for lack of a better word, would be called God, would be called the ineffable, the one. I mean, there's countless monistic terms for it. That's my perspective on the matter, and I've come to this conclusion over the course of many years, which is why it's difficult for me to succinctly put it into words in this video, because I can't just illustrate all the progressions that I made over the course of many years. It's kind of hard to. But every time I've studied any monistic view, I thought, these people get it. This video is a lot harder. Like, now that I'm making it, like, all my videos are just sort of they're not pre-scripted or anything, and this is actually a lot more difficult than any other video I've ever done, which is funny because it doesn't require knowledge about outside information. It's 100% about my opinion. I guess because I feel like I'm having to defend my opinion. But if you look at Platonism, Neoplatonism, Hinduism, to a lesser extent Buddhism, because it regards it as more irrelevant, all those views ascribe to the idea that the individual comprises something greater. And you see this even with human societies. I touched up on this a little bit when I was talking about superorganisms in a previous video. There's an interesting result that stems from people cooperating together, which is something ends up happening at some point, and it's hard to define that point. It goes kind of hand in hand with the ship of Theseus, and when I was talking about with the cells in the body. After a certain point, a group of people stops just being several individuals working in tandem, and they become something else. They become a community that has its own culture. You see this in businesses. You see this in clubs. You see this in cities and communities. You see this in nations and states, where something develops, partly I think out of kin selection, because usually these are homogenous groups, and I'm not going to get into that because this is not a political video, but I think it's interesting to note that we're seeing a deterioration of those kinds of identities in connection with a deterioration of kin selection. But you see that something forms that's greater than the sum of their parts. And I would regard that as a spiritual entity. I was explaining that in a previous video once, that when a city works together and comes up with deities that represent their city and represent their culture, things start happening that illustrate that those deities are real, which is why it's kind of funny. One of my favorite arguments that I hear atheists use is usually against monotheists, not monists like myself. Oh, so you believe in this one God, but you reject all the other 10 million gods or however many that have previously existed. Well, I don't. I think they're all real. I think that every single belief system has really hit the nail on the head through some lens or another with which they viewed the truth. I just think that the truth, it's something that transcends our abilities to understand it, largely because we are limited in our senses. We are limited by culture. It's funny, these deities, they always change because the public morality changes. Well, of course they do. Why wouldn't they? It would be ridiculous to think that a deity who ascribes to slavery 4,000 years ago isn't going to undergo some changes as the societies start to have a more negative view of that system, right? Well, that doesn't mean that deity ceased to exist or was wrong to begin with. It just means that they were the lens changed. The lens through which that truth was viewed changed. That's my issue with objectivism. Someone can say, this cup is blue. Well, I observe it as blue, and you probably observe it as blue, and everybody else and their grandma, unless they're colorblind, probably views it as blue. But that's only because that's what our senses are telling us, because our senses evolved for our survival. What's really happening is a whole bunch of subatomic particles are vibrating, and the vibrations match a resonance so that when light strikes it, a human perceives it as blue. A honeybee, on the other hand, who's capable of seeing the ultraviolet spectrum, may see something completely different. Does that mean that I'm wrong and the honeybee's right, or vice versa? No, that would be ridiculous. Well, similarly, different cultures, because of their need for survival in different areas, they're going to perceive that truth with a capital T through different colored lenses, and those lenses manifest themselves as deities. I admire Hinduism more than any other belief system for that reason, because they acknowledge it. Like, they look at that and they're like, yeah, all those gods are real, but there's only one that's also real, which they comprise, they make up, just as you and I do, and everything else. That's a great way of looking at it, because it means that they acknowledge that the truth is something that sort of eludes us when we look at it from an objective standpoint, when we try to look at it through just a purely sensory standpoint. Man, this video is going to go too long. See, I tried to summarize things, and it's really hard. I'm gonna stop right now. TLDW, monism absolutely changed perspectives over the course of my life. Would definitely regard myself as theistic, not agnostic, and not atheistic. Don't dislike atheism. Strongly dislike atheism for the same reason why I dislike fundamentalism. Neither of them are capable of being creative. Neither of them are capable of looking at things through another person's perspective. They just want to be right. And I don't want to be right. I want to know the truth. Whether I do know the truth or not, I almost certainly don't. I'm probably just picking up little fragments of what every day brings me closer to knowing the truth. Hopefully, someday, maybe over the course of several lifetimes even, because that's another thing I ascribe to, if consciousness is a separate construct from physical reality, then consciousness is going to change from vehicle to vehicle. That's why I love to think of my body as my spacesuit. God, that sounded crazier than I thought I would out loud. But, I mean it from a logical standpoint. I might make a whole video about that, actually. But, yeah, that summarizes everything, I think, decently. Also, I guess you could argue pantheistic, because I think that divinity with a capital D is manifested through everything that we see, but most logically through natural phenomena, because that's the way things were set up initially. Not to try and make the universe sound like a mechanical construct. It's more like an organic construct. In fact, I don't really agree with everything the guy says. I certainly don't agree with a lot of aspects from his life. But a great place to start to sort of understand what I'm talking about would be Alan Watts. I really like Alan Watts' videos, even though he does focus a lot more on the more entertainment aspect of it, and there are plenty of things I disagree with. I think that it's a great way to sort of have a primer into monism from a Western perspective. Really recommend that. I think that describes everything currently. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. See you.